Dober večer, pozdravljene, pozdravljeni. Danes dobrodošli na današnjem večeru o predstavitvi slovenskega prevoda grafičnega romana Peršmanova domačija, 25. april 1954. To je naslov. Danes so z nami pisateljica oziroma avtorica romana Evelyn Steinthaler in dr. Daniel Wutti, strokovnjak za spominsko krajino na Koroškem. Today we will be speaking in a mixture of Slovenian and English, since Evelyn passively understands Slovenian but would like to express herself in English. And also my presentation will switch between the languages, and you are more than welcome to pose your questions in any language you feel comfortable, and then we will translate it, and it's multilinguality in practice. So let me first introduce our guests. Evelyn Steinthaler is an author, editor, audiobook producer, biographer, and lecturer at the University of Vienna. She worked previously in journalism and PR, and nowadays she primarily works in socio-political projects that are dedicated to empowerment of women and girls that are endangered or discriminated in different ways. She works on these workshops where writing is a way of empowering women that are, for instance, refugees. And she also writes textual pieces for memorial projects in Austria and Germany. And she has also extensively already published, doing what we would say like fiction memorialization or non-fiction memorialization. For instance, in 2008, she got award Bruno Kreisky Prize for the political books for her book on women in 1938, persecuted, resistant, and followers. So it's about women in Austria at the very beginning of Nazi regime. She also wrote a biography of Richard Tauber, a Jewish film and opera star in Austria who, as a Jewish person, needed to flee the Nazi regime. She wrote a book, Vienna 1945, Chronicle, and in addition to Peršmanova, she also did an audiobook about another young woman involved in the resistance, communist resistance during Second World War in Austria. Her most recent book is biography of Katja Sturm-Schnabel, a Slovenian linguist who was teaching literary history at University of Vienna. And is a prominent member of the Slovenian community in Carinthia, but also, I think, a figure of a woman herself, and her traumatic story of her family is also representative of the persecution that Slovenian community experienced in Austria, in Carinthia. Daniel Wutti, as I said, is an expert in Carinthian memory culture and minority-majority relations. He works at the Institute for Multilingualism and Transcultural Education at the Higher School of Education in Klagenfurt, Celovec. His PhD was about trauma, memory, and identity with focus on Carinthia. And he also studied media and communication. He has recently co-edited two books that are particularly relevant for the topic we are discussing today. One is Spominske kulture v obmejnem območju, ki je prišla leta 2020 pri Mohorjevi založbi in Slovenija, Avstrija, osvobajajoče spominjanje, dialoško obravnavanje zgodovine. Kaj je dialoško obravnavanje zgodovine, bomo danes govorili o tem. Oba, in Evelyn in Daniel, sta vključena v Mauthausen Memorial. Evelyn je vključena v edukacijski program in vodenja skupin. Daniel pa je v bistvu član Mauthausen komiteta za Koroško, ki je kot ena interesna skupina, ki sodeluje pri ustvarjanju vsebin v Mauthausen Memorialu in je tudi vključen v pedagoške programe. My name is Jovana Mihajlović Trbovc, and I'm a researcher at the Institute of Culture and Memory Studies here at ZRC SAZU, and I'm a memory studies and gender studies scholar. So, Peršmanova domačija is just one in the line of graphic novels that were published by Založba ZRC, which are thematizing troubling war events, troubling history, and Založba ZRC published first such graphic novel. It was Maus by Art Spiegelman. Then some of the more known were Goražde, Varovano območje Goražde, and Fixer or Posrednik by Joe Sacco. And most recently we published graphic novel Vojna, War, by Goran Duplančić, which is thematizing 10-day war in Slovenia. So in this way, the Peršmanova domačija nicely fits both the genre and the topic that we are trying to develop here at Založba ZRC. So this particular graphic novel presents events that took place in April 1945, at the very end of the Second World War at Peršmanhof, Peršmanova domačija, which is a farm high in the mountains just on the other Austrian side of border, near above Železna Kapla, Eisenkapel. This was a place where Carinthian partisans, Koroški partizani, found refuge and hiding place at a Slovenian family who was living at this farm and who supported partisans' fight against Nazi regime. From the Anschluss in 1938, when Austria became part of the Third Reich, Carinthian Slovenes were successively transported to the concentration and labor camps and robbed of their property, persecuted, killed in many ways. Carinthian partisans were connected to the Yugoslav partisan movement, but were actually grassroots resistance movement that emerged in 1943 and was actually the only armed resistance movement that existed in Austria. So in this sense, they are also important for Austrian state, not just for a Slovenian community in it. So on the 25th of April 1945, when the end of war was coming near, and just 2 weeks before Allied forces met Yugoslav partisans on the border of Carinthia, the territory was at this point still under control of Nazi forces. On that day, 25th April, SS police regiment got information that partisans were staying near Peršmanhof, Peršmanova domačija farmhouse. They attacked and mutual shelling ensued between the two armed groups. However, after the partisans fled into the wood, SS police returned and, as a retaliation, set on fire the farmhouse and killed the whole Sadovnik family that was living there, including 7 children. Only 3 children managed to survive, And one of them, Anna Maria Sadonik, is the main character of the novel, and she is represented as a girl on the cover page of the novel. She later returned to the house after the war, managed to rebuild it, and lived there practically almost until the end of her life. And she lived there even after the part of the house turned into a museum in 1982. It was turned into a museum by a group or association of supporters of Corinthian partisans that was established in 1948, and I'm wearing their shirt that I bought on 70th anniversary. They are still active, and they are still organizing every year commemorative events in front of Peršman House. So this event was unquestionably a war crime, or crime against the civilians, to be precise, but it was never adequately prosecuted by the Austrian judicial system. And until relatively recently, this event existed only in the memoryscape of Slovenian community and was largely forgotten or unknown by larger Austrian audience. A detailed explanation of legal process related to this crime and public memory about it you can read in the essay by Lisa Retl that is at the very end of this book. It's very informative and I recommend it. So, bearing all this in mind, that this introduction that was probably a bit too long, Evelyn, could you please share with us your motivation, your personal motivation for making this graphic novel? At the beginning of the book, you write an intimate essay about your feeling whether you have a voice or what is your voice in this story. But I would like you to to tell us more about it, but also to tell us to whom you wrote this novel, whom you had in mind when you were writing it. Who was your audience?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for doing the book in Slovenian. I mean, this is so important that it's now finally also available and readable in Slovenian. Thank you so much. For me, there are several points. I mean, there's like in my own history, my Slovenian grandmother, who married a non-Slovenian man, and of course she had the whole thing that goes on regularly with Austrian Slovenian women marrying a non-Slovenian husband, that they stop speaking Slovenian. So I learned from her, and I lived with her through her memories, of course. She was born in 1915, so I remember when I was 9 years old, she made me watch with her the Tito funeral, and I sat with her and watched, because of course I watched with my grandmother and sit there, and everybody else was out playing. It was a lovely sunny day, and I was for hours watching this with her. So this is partly for my grandmother and the heritage with my grandmother, who's very dear and was very important for me. And on the other side, after learning, I was in my early 20s when I learned about Peršman, and I did not know before. And when I learned it and went there with my mother, who's not Corinthian, and so we did go there, and I saw Anchi, and she was there, and I thought, how can this work? You know, this is a museum, and this woman, and she's probably one of the kids. So then I learned it was really her. So this was something that really, really struck me then. And then it took me years and several travels to France and to realizing how big graphic novels and comics are in the field of working on Shoah and, you know, and the Second World War. And in the German-speaking world, there's nothing like it. I mean, you have this in Italy, you have this in France particularly, and I thought, okay, this is just nothing. And then a person who draws comics said to me, why don't you do a political comic, and I thought, yeah, of course. And then I realized how important or what kind of ways could be opened if I would sit down and make a book on a very particular story. And I happened to visit Lisa Rettel at one point. This was in 2014, so 9 years ago. And a year after Anna Sadonik died, or months after she died, and I suddenly had this idea telling her story in a graphic novel, and not for her and not really for my grandmother, because I know my grandmother knew this, because she also said when we went to Klagenfurt, or in our neighborhood, she said, you don't speak to him, he was in the SS, you don't greet him, you know, she was like really very strict. And so it wasn't for the two of them, it was for those who have no idea. Mm-hmm. So it's the larger, having these two women in my mind, or I had my grandmother who was called by her friends also Anchi. So these two women in my mind, but definitely for a larger Austrian audience, just to educate them. I mean, I work in education now in Mauthausen and Memorial, so I had this urge to educate people without being a teacher all the time. But I felt like I need to educate and to tell, and that people cannot say, oh, this is just on the border somewhere, and then tell them also the importance of the partisans. You know, I mean, Austria would not have the Austrian treaty without the partisans in Carinthia. So this is also something that really also is important for people in Upper Austria, in Salzburg, in Vorarlberg, in the Tyrol, and in Vienna. So yeah, that's a long answer. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
To what extent is your impression that people, an average Austrian citizen who is German-speaking, is aware that Corinthian partisans existed, and what is their historical and political importance, like the Austrian treaty? Do you think this is part of a general knowledge?
No. And the problem is also that the anti-communist propaganda, that really stuck with people, still does, that is kind of, in Carinthia particularly, in some ways still, but also that, well, yeah, they were the communists, and we don't have to thank them for anything. Mm-hmm. And this is something that I realized, and also people outside of Corinth, also in Vienna, and I did some talks with the book in Berlin, mm-hmm. and they were like, wow, we didn't know there were partisans. Really? I thought they were just in Yugoslavia. What did they do in Carinthia? This is also, mm-hmm. or they say, like, okay, partisans in Italy and in Yugoslavia, but Austria. So I learned that there is a huge gap of knowledge, and also this kind of, but this doesn't have to do anything with us, so they don't understand mm-hmm. the connection. Well, a lot of people, but some do, and I hope it does make a point in there, but I think there's still huge gaps. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But it's my impression, what I learned through the book. Mm.
Daniel, what is your impression? What meanings does this crime at Peršman trigger in the collective memory of Austria, of Carinthia, of Slovenian community? Mm-hmm. Why this particular event and story of Corinthian partisans? What different associations and memorial affects are connected to it?
Thank you, ja. To je tudi z moje strani najlepša hvala. Slovenščina je moja materinščina, sem zamejski Slovenc, bom pa tudi tu govoril večinoma angleško. Vsekakor me zelo veseli, da sem danes povabljen tu, ker mi oboje veliko pomeni govoriti o tej temi, pa tudi tako rekoč skupaj z kolegico Evelyn Steinthaler in z Jovano. Hvala lepa. So, concerning your question, I think Peršman event, it was a massacre, of course, and it was a huge, tragic event. And at one point, it was just one of a lot of events which were very tragic, and a lot of problems which the Slovene minority and Slovene population faced in Second World War, but Slovene population in Carinthia was also facing problems before Second World War. We know about the plebiscite and all those Slovene people who had to flee Carinthia in Austria after the plebiscite in 1920. And we had, of course, a lot of troubles in Slovene population after Second World War II, and this is very important. So all these traumatic events, they are very much commemorated by the Slovenes themselves, but majority population do not mind at all. So they somehow really don't care, and most people, most young people, even nowadays, don't learn about Slovenes, about bilingual Carinthia, about the history of their own country, let's say, of their own Carinthia in Austria, which is bilingual, multicultural, of course, bilingual. So they grow up without knowing anything about these topics. And this is, I think, what is faced or what is triggered by this event, and especially triggered by the place of Peršman in this case. So, for example, you have to imagine, Jovana, you mentioned it, it's farming house, or it was a farming house high in the mountains, and from Klagenfurt, from the center of bilingual Carinthia, you have to drive more than 50 minutes. It is even nowadays the only museum in which resistance, very important resistance against National Socialism in Carinthia, is thematized. It's still the only museum which shows in a detailed way about the history of Carinthian Slovenes. So you have to drive a lot, you have to find yourself on almost 1,000 meters above sea level to learn more about Slovene population, about bilinguality of Carinthia, and about the very important resistance fight of the partisans. So, especially in Austrian history, it's important because it was the resistance fight of Carinthian Slovenes which later somehow allowed Austria to regain its own borders from before 1938. And this is a certain detail of history which is not known by pupils, which is not known by adults. So this is a problem, and I think it's very important for Austrians, for Carinthians of majority population to learn about these details. So just to add another thought, in the center of Klagenfurt, Zelovec, and it's really in the center, we can find even nowadays a huge memorial which is commemorating Carinthians, German Carinthians, which were murdered by partisans. And the inscription, the text is really in German something like, for all those Carinthians who were brutally murdered by partisans, for that it should never happen again. So it's somehow literally now translated. But we have here really two very different memorial opinions, narratives, and I mean, we have 2023. I think it's highly on time that narratives, opinions about history are somehow connecting. So later, maybe we can talk about this connecting or coming together of narratives. But however, I think it's also very important that pupils and Carinthians learn about bilingual Carinthians. They should learn about partisans. They should learn about the history of their own region. And this is still even nowadays a problem, and not as it should be. So I think it's huge pedagogical tasks.
Mm-hmm. It's a huge task and challenge for the future. But can you tell us, have you noticed some changes in the recent period? Lisa Rettel is saying that certain things did change since 2000. Slovenia entering Schengen, there is no such strict border, and there is no this anti-communist narrative that in a way prevented any moderate discussion about Carinthian partisans within the Austrian discourse. So what has changed in the past 20, 30 years maybe?
to sum it up very shortly and maybe also somehow provocative, it has changed that Slovenes in Carinthia and Slovenes in general are not anymore the main enemy or the problem of most Corinthians, of German nationalist traditional Corinthians like Heimatdienst and Abwehrkämpferbund. So Heimatdienst and Abwehrkämpferbund accept Slovenes, and we can find, for example, Andreas Mölzer, who really some years ago on a European level was trying to connect the European far right in European parties and so on. He, as we know, is one of the ideologists of the FPÖ in Austria, which is a right-wing party, and he's now chief of the Kärntner Heimatdienst. We can read interviews in Corinthian newspapers, international newspapers, also in Slovenia. We can read that he likes Corinthian Slovenes now, but he has another enemy, and this is, for example, Muslims and all the other cultures. Let's type it under stress. So we as Corinthian Slovenes are in a kind of privileged position right now. We are not anymore enemy. We have to state that there are probably so little Slovenes anymore, so that even Heimatdienst and Mölzer are acknowledging that Slovenes cannot be any more problem, Corinthian Slovenes any more problem, so there are other enemies now. This is what changed. But anyway, to put it less provocative, even also Corinthian society has changed a lot, and we can find anti-Slovene positions even now, but they are not anymore in the middle of society, and there are at least 4 or 5 certain circumstances which led to it. One of them is literature, other are politics. Maybe in detail we can talk about it later. Or if you want, I could.
Yeah, let's talk about it now, but maybe we can shift to Evelyn in the sense, in what ways did some cultural products, novel, popular culture, influence this shift in the public perception of Second World War, of the knowledge about persecution of Slovenes, of events like the one at Peršmanova. Mm-hmm. What is your impression? Did it have influential impact?
Oh yes, certainly. Particularly the novel of Maya Hadalab, Engel des Vergessens, which she published not in Slovenian but in German first, and she won the Ingeborg Bachmann Prize. And that made a huge move, I think, because a lot of people, as I learned, were saying, "Okay, this is a story of a Slovenian family on this farm in Lepena, but I can connect, with this growing up in this family, even though maybe the father was not on the partisan side, but on the." But it's just not they're not talking in the history, mm-hmm. in the story. I think that made it very approachable for a lot of people, and I think that made a huge shift. And so there's also a crime series on Sunday evening in Austria and in Germany and in Switzerland, and there's one where it's like. One time it's from Germany, from all kinds of different cities, and there's one from Vienna, and there's one episode that tells the story of Peršman. Well, not correctly, but it does tell the story of Peršman. And so, because they shift something with the SS police and so it's, but they use that on Sunday evening, and there are many, many people in the German-speaking world watching this series. So I think that was huge that they did that, and so I think these two were really important, and also in order to make it approachable for those who have no personal connection, mm-hmm. can say, okay, I have the Slovenian grandmother or so, but to say, okay, there's a story, okay, what's going on there? So I think art has a huge function in this, and so as important as science is and all these, these books that we need to work with, then we have the resources for us. Then I think it's important to get more into popular culture, and that is only possible if you go into novels and film, or even a graphic novel.
Yeah, so...
And there's one thing I want just before, because you talked about, you know, the enemy and so, and I think the problem of Austria is, well, there are many, but the one particular is that there was this federal chancellor who signed the treaty in 55 and who was deported in 38 to Dachau and then was in Mauthausen imprisoned and then was liberated in jail in Vienna. And the first, Leopold Fiegel, and the first thing he did when he ran for office in 45, December 46. When he ran for office, he said the Austrians who served the German Wehrmacht defended their home, and they did not. And that was something that this is something that really stuck in a lot of German-speaking Austrians, and that goes over generations. So, I mean, in order to get votes, of course, he said that, because when he ran for office, then the former Nazi party members were allowed to vote again. And so, of course, it was just about getting votes for the Conservative Party. But I think that made a huge impact on the later on self-understanding of those who served in the Wehrmacht and who committed crimes in the Wehrmacht, because they said, we only did it for Austria. No, they didn't. Yeah. That's what I just wanted to add to what we talked before.
Yeah, so is this image being changed nowadays? Daniel, you work in education. You are probably familiar with the history curriculum or the curriculum for civic education. Is this historical representation of Wehrmacht that existed after Second World War that Evelyn just described, is it a changed shift nowadays?
Maybe slowly. There is still a lot to do. So, for example, if we just compare in each single small village, you can find memorials for Wehrmacht soldiers. And, for example, Peter Gstettner, as a professor, speaks about a memorial troika. So they connect Abwehrkampf, which is anti-Slovene, let's say, with memorials for heroes of the First World War, which are, of course, soldiers, and then they connect these Wehrmacht soldiers. So it's those three memorials we can find in each single small village in Carinthia. And in comparison to that, we can find not even 10 visible memorials for deported Carinthian Slovenes in 1942. And as we know, these were deportations of the Slovene population of the Nazi regime. So it's a huge difference, and there is really a lot to do. So what we can say also is that concerning memorials, most of the memorials for victims of National Socialism were in past and even nowadays initiatives of private organizations, private persons, and later on public hand financed it partially, but mostly it were private initiations, while of course all the other narratives were hugely supported by official hand. So what we can see right now is, for example, in some villages even now it's possible for the first time that public hand finances, for example, memorials for Carinthian Slovenes in 1942, and maybe in, for example, the city, southern Carinthian city, Ferlach-Borole will be one of the first cities which really, as a city, as a government city, establishes a memorial for Carinthian Slovenes. So it changes. In pedagogical fields, there is still a lot to do. So what happened over the decades of not speaking, what happened over the decades of just showing one perspective of history, blending out bilingual Carinthia, multiculturalism. What happened is that we work now with young people who don't know what partisans are and who don't know about Carinthian Slovenes at all. So they don't know about their home, let's say. I'm repeating myself a bit, but it's really a huge problem. So when I work, it doesn't matter if I work on university in lectures or at my institution, Pedagoška Visoka Šola, Pedagogische Hochschule, we work on a really low basic, starting from a low level, explaining and discussing what partisans were, what were their aims, and even about Corinthian Slovenes, we start on a low level. So we start on a low level, then we find very interesting young persons who really love to learn a lot of these interesting topics, and after some time it's already on a high level in which we discuss and they learn.
Thank you. I would like to go back to a topic that we a bit left over, and that is the power of art, or potentials of art form to narrate complex, traumatic history that is usually problematic to talk about or is less known. So what is your impression of graphic novel as a medium for such a form of narration? What it has what are good sides of graphic novel? What is its potential?
I don't know any bad sides. The good, it does allow people who don't think comics or graphic novels make fun, or only Mickey Mouse and and da. If one does accept or does know where also comics come from, with who started with Superman. It was Jewish refugees from Europe who started to draw Superman fighting the Nazis in newspapers during the war. So if one is aware of that or does not think this is making any topic less valuable, it is opening up stories for people who might not sit down and read a novel, or might not sit down and read scientific texts, but it makes it more approachable. And even if people are not keen on reading, you can watch pictures and you can watch the panels, and you can tell a story in panels, and you don't need words, or the words lie behind it. And I think that is something that draws a lot of people to comics and to graphic novels, because you learn history. I mean, what Art Spiegelman did is so amazing, and many others.
In a way, Art Spiegelman established a genre and gave it legitimacy of seriosity, because he, as a second generation of survivor, had the right to write or to draw about Holocaust.
I mean, there's this Italian comic writer, Igot, and he wrote these messages from Ukraine, which is, I think, one of the he wrote on the Holodomor. And I think this is so fantastic graphic novel. He wrote also one on messages from Russia, where he tells the story of Anna Politkovskaya and her murdering. And you can use graphic novel as a tool to tell the story and to reach out to people who would normally never sit down and say, now I read the story of the murdering, or on the Holodomor, or on Anna Politkovskaya. So I think it just opens up so much, and it invites so many people who would normally not take a book, or who would normally not go near to a book that has like 200 pages. Like, it's too much.
Yeah. But it's not simple as just being digest history.
No, of course not. No, we don't want it simple.
Yeah. But tell us the story from Le Pen you told me before, of an old lady.
Oh, yes.
Who felt offended.
I was, when we had the book presentation in Le Pen, I was, of course, kind of scared to go there. And I thought, okay, how will the community react? Me coming from Vienna and, have this Selovets background and not being one of the community to come there. And it was a lovely evening, and at one point an elderly lady stood up and said, "You're making fun of us." And we were like, oh my God, what is she talking about? And she just heard the word comic and was completely offended. And then we started to tell her where the idea comes from to do this comic, or to do the graphic novel, and the history of graphic novel, and what we want to do with this book. And so she felt seen, and she really saw that we are serious with what we wanted or what I wanted. And later on, Gudrun Bloberger came and introduced me to her, and it was Predica, the daughter of Helene Kucha, and I almost fell off my chair because I read about her, of course, in the book of Helene Kucha, and I thought, okay, this lady is the baby that was thrown into the snow, and I felt very I thanked her a lot to have asked this question, because of course this is so important, because I never wanted to have anybody in the community felt unseen or haven't been made fun of. So this was really, really important that she was so, well, I was sorry for her that she was so upset, but in the process it was really important that we had this discussion to make clear that it's nothing that we ever wanted to do.
Yeah. Just a footnote, Helena Kucher is a woman who established anti-fascist Front of Women of Carinthia, just like AFEŽ in Yugoslavia, and was basically a woman fighter herself.
Yes. Her fighting name was Jelka.
Jelka, yeah, and Gudrun Goldberg is Blum. Sorry, can you?
Gudrun Bloberger.
Yes. Is now director of Mauthausen Museum and a historian a historian who got very much involved and co-edited with Lisa Rettel one of the most comprehensive books about Peršmanov as a place of event, but of a crime, but also as a place of memory.
She was chair at Peršman, yeah?
Yes, yeah. For some years. Of course, Društvo Peršman, that Daniel is a member of, is a self-organized organization that keeps up this museum. It's not publicly funded, it's not publicly established, as you said before. Daniel, you are using graphic novels as part of workshops for pupils in schools as part of history and civic education workshops. Can you tell us more about it?
Yes. So I brought it with me, and it's just one example. But we were, as an organization, thinking about how we can introduce this hard topic, this traumatic, tragic topic to young pupils so they can learn about it. And as I mentioned, and as we heard before from Evelyn and Jovana also, I think Peršmanova domačija is a place where a lot of topics can be taught to young persons. So it's important to bring young persons there, and Društvo Peršman, organization Peršman, is really striving to bring more and more young persons up there to this mountain place, mountain village, to for them to learn about all these topics. So we thought about possibilities and options of how history can be taught in an interesting way. And of course, one main idea was that for young persons, comparison of different narratives of the past can be very interesting. And I think this is also scientifically proven that it's interesting to compare different narratives, and we see how young people react on it. So they don't just hear anymore one narrative, one version of the past, but and here at this certain point, even the minority viewpoint is very interesting. So they learn and see for the first time the minority viewpoint on National Socialism, on the region, on the history of the region. This is one main marker, and others were media. So, for example, we thought about including resistance songs, and you all know Bella Ciao, and there is a famous disco version now, which I personally don't like that much. I prefer the original one, but young persons, all of them, or a lot of them, in each single class they have heard the new disco version of Bella Ciao, and some of the young persons reflect for the first time, oh wow, it's a resistance song, and what is a resistance song, for what was their meaning, so for example. And another is Tri rdeči žvižgi, drei rote Pfiffe, which was in Austria very famous 30, 40 years ago, and even now can be, it is a very sensitive song and about the resistance of the Schmetterlinge, Austrian alternative band 40 years ago, let's say. So another point was reflecting on the memorial on Peršman and the memorial on Peršman, which you can not see on the cover of the book, but if you Google just our organization Peršman, the memorial is very visible, and of course it's also painted, drawn in the book. The memorial is the biggest partisan memorial in southern Austria. So we discuss and let the people reflect on this memorial too. And besides that, what I mentioned now, we found that this graphic novel can be a very, very interesting possibility for young people to learn and to discuss and to reflect on what happened there. So what we included is in our workshop book or workshop guidance note, we have certain tasks for the pupils to complete. And one task is we, with of course the okay of the publishers and Evelyn, we printed some parts of the graphic novel, but without the text. So people can think about, young persons can think about what is happening there and later compare their ideas with the original graphic novel. And the results are just great. So they really see certain different media and they like it. So I think it's a modern way to discuss topics of history, and people like it.
It's a very interactive approach. Also, the story of the memorial itself is a history of the memory. The memorial is also drawn in the graphic novel. It's a symbol of a Corinthian Partisan Association, a symbol of Društvo Peršman. Can you just tell us in very short the history of the monument, because it tells a lot?
Yeah, the memorial, it was a huge, let's say normal, but big partisan memorial in a certain place in a southern Corinthian village. And it was bombed then in the 1970s, quite early it was bombed. So the Društvo Zveza Koroških Partizanov, they took all the pieces of the memorial and erected it again on Peršmanhof. So it became a symbol of Peršman, and nowadays we have the memorial there, which shows kind of heroic partisan resistance fight, and at the same time Peršman is also as place victim memorial. So it connects, the place connects both heroic partisans memorial and victims, civil victims which were murdered. So even from this point of view, Peršman is a special place.
Isn't it the monument, the only monument where a woman is with shown
as an arm with weapon.
With a weapon
in her.
So that's the only one. It's not like the weeping mother or somebody who lost somebody, but she's like active in fight. Mm-hmm. And I think that's also something particular about this monument.
Yeah, thank you. Mm-hmm.
I think maybe for us in the territory of former Yugoslavia, where many of these monuments managed to survive, not all of them, seeing women with a weapon was not so strange. Maybe a typical image would, for Yugoslav representation, would be a woman having weapon in one hand and a child in another. But in Austrian context, seeing a woman with a weapon in the hand is not visible. Yeah. But I think it tells a lot about the situation that this, monument created in very typical style of the time in the late 40s. So it's a big monument. It is standing in front of a house in hills. Basically, you need very good GPS to find it. It is built for a big public square. not for a mountain hamlet.
We talked before about this, where it should be put, and I said it should be in Zelovec, where they have the stone of the partisans. You know, this should be
The victims of,
it should be next
of
to that.
partisan bandits, it should be
It
in
would be my
front of
favorite
it.
place.
Yeah.
Memory, counter memory. Would be nice.
So, Evelyn, to conclude a bit the story about less known historical chapters, persecution of Slovene minorities is one of them. But it seems when we look at your work and also at this graphic novel, that you're particularly drawn to presenting history from women's perspective or through women's biographies, women as the main characters. What we can learn from focusing on this historically marginal position of viewing history. Usually history is not told by women, especially not young women. So what draws you particularly to try to present history from this angle?
It is the fact that with telling female stories, you get you have the history and you have the her story. And you have, when you put the women in perspective, you tell their stories, you can get a puzzle and you can put things together. You have the official, and then you have the women standing by or standing next to it, and are still, even if they are standing next to those who write the history, they still cannot be seen. And if you draw them out of the shadow, you make a picture wider. You can it's a puzzle thing for me. So make more visible than what the official history tells you. And I think with women approaching women's stories, because you have them, in every group. I mean, you have the Slovenian women, you have the Jews in Austria, from the different minorities or from the majority. And if you take those who were bystanders and watched and said, okay, I don't care, if you tell their stories, you also put parts in the puzzle. So to put everything together, and I think we will be working on this for the next decades, just for that few years, for that 7 years only. There's still so much to do, or even for Romani women, Romnis telling their stories, or Sintece. So this is getting them out of the place where they stuck and fulfill the picture. When I did the book on women in 1938, I wanted to interview women who were taken to concentration camps because they were Jehovah's Witnesses. Because I said, okay, this is so important because they were taken to concentration camps, and there's one word that was around when I was a child, when I grew up in Austria. It's the I lost it now. That was used for Jehovah's Witnesses, and it was, of course, one word that was introduced by the Nazis, that continued to be used. Yeah, and that particular lady I approached, she said, no, I'm too old, thank you very much, I don't want to talk about it anymore. I'm done. She was in her 90s then, so I understood, of course. But I think, just women make the picture fulfill, brighten it up, or it's not one line, it's even much wider.
Story of Anna Sadovnik in the graphic novel also opens up a question: what happens with people after, in the aftermath of crime, after. In the context of this memory. So Anna Sadovnik at the beginning and the end of the novel is presented as an old lady living in a house that is partially turned into a museum, and you can see her awkwardness or uneasiness of being watched as if she is
an object.
An object, yeah, and so many layers of her personal history that happen in that house, her children, grandchildren being there, growing up, is not part of the narrative of Sadovnik family as a victim of SS crime. I found that very intimate and not very direct in your novel. Why was this important for you? What made you to pay attention to this? This is also usually not part of the memory or victim narrative. What happens with people in everyday life?
I think it's possible in the way we approach the stories of those who endured this horror, we can re-victimize them. And this is something that I wanted to approach and I wanted to look at, and even with the best intentions, you know, that we say, oh yeah. And so I learned that also at the memorial quite often when people come to visit. So, but even before I realized that this is something what we do, no matter if we are like, you know, the liberals or left-wing, you know, whichever background we come, it just happens that we re-victimize people who endured what they were traumatized with. And this was something that I wanted to look at. And while thinking, and I thought for years about how to tell a story, this was what I ended up with, because I tried different ways, and I thought, no, Anna Sadovnik must be in the center, because she was the one who came to my mind. I want to tell with her the story, and I did not want to let the whole story in 1945, but to tell it with, make a sort of an extra
Frame?
Yeah, I think that's the word. Put a frame on that story. I think it was really important.
Yeah. So
for me,
thank you so much for making this book and doing it in such a sensitive way, opening all these issues of politicality of memory, but also this like very intimate side. And thank you, Daniel, for using this graphic novel in everyday practice and being part of the memorial culture that is important in so many ways, and specifically not only for Slovene community. So thank you for doing your job, and thank you for being tonight here. And now I open the floor if anybody would like to pose a question or give their reflection and a comment to many topics that we posed today. Maybe just to say, how can we reach Peršmanova domačija, like now from Ljubljana?
Yeah, so one way is, of course, to just type in the internet, the Peršmanova domačija, and you will surely find our organization, and one of our members will for sure somehow help you on mail or by phone, and we can of course also find you there and explain you there. So usually in spring and in summer and up in late autumn, each weekend someone is there to have the museum open and to show and guide people around and to explain also. And yeah, so just give us a contact maybe.
And you should have a car to go.
Yes.
Yes. Or you like to hike.
Yeah.
You like to walk.
And it can be quite cold in the summertime.
Yes, even in summer, yeah.
But it's a great journey up there. So you can drive over Jezersko, for example, and so Bad Eisenkapelle, Železna Kapla. And driving there, you can visit a big part of bilingual Carinthia, of course. And search for bilingual topographical signs, dvojezične krajovne table.
There's also that Strauko Halalab, he's doing hiking tours, where you can go to the shelters of the partisans in the woods. I mean, you really not need to be able to walk well for that trekking, but it's fantastic to go. Yeah.
And he makes also literary walks. So,
Yes.
for example, this very famous book of his sister, Maya Hadalap, he makes
Angel
literary
Pozabe, yeah,
tours.
it
Angel
was
Pozabe,
mentioned, yeah.
So he makes literary tours too.
Of the places connected with the book.
Yes.
Yes. If there are any more questions, I just wanted to say that Azil Bookshop is open, je odprta še zdaj in lahko kupite, dobite strip po discountu. V vsakem primeru hvala vam. Zdaj bo sledila majhna pogostitev, upam, da bomo ostali še v pogovoru. Res hvala in hvala, da ste prišli in da ste ustvarili to zgodbo in današnji večer. Hvala.
Hvala lepa.
Hvala.